Alexey, a 25-year-old programmer, was tired of city life and decided to take a break, away from civilization. While browsing online for a remote place to stay, he came across a listing for an old house in a small village called Lesnoye. The house looked rather run down, but the price was incredibly affordable. It'll do, Alexey thought. He contacted the local real estate agent, and a week later, he was on his way to Lesnoye. When he arrived, he noticed the locals giving him wary looks. Conversations seemed to stop whenever he walked by. He assumed it was just typical village behavior, where strangers were always viewed with suspicion, and didn't give it much thought. Soon, he met with the elderly real estate agent, a woman in her 60s with a lined face and piercing eyes. She reluctantly handed him the keys and asked him to be careful, but didn't explain further. The house stood on the edge of the village, surrounded by thick trees and dense brush. Inside, it smelled of dampness and mildew. Alexey couldn't shake the feeling that someone was living there, but he convinced himself it was just due to the house's age and condition. On the very first night, he felt uneasy. Echoing footsteps seemed to reverberate through the house, though he was alone. The old floorboards creaked as if someone were moving down the hall. He chalked it up to the wind and the house's old structure, but the odd occurrences didn't stop. The next day, Alexey decided to explore the house more thoroughly. In one room, he found an old book, a journal written in a strange, scrawled handwriting. The pages were worn, stained in places with something dark. As he flipped through it, he began reading about bizarre occurrences that had happened in the house and around it. The entries mentioned a cult that supposedly inhabited the area long ago, secret rituals, and people who got lost in the darkness and never returned. The more he read, the stronger his sense of unease became. One entry was written by a man named Grigory, who described waking up in the middle of the night, paralyzed, unable to move. He felt a dark, cold presence hovering over him, with icy breath against his skin. His arms felt pinned to the bed, and he couldn't even scream. After that entry, there was no more writing from Grigory. Chills ran down Alexey's spine, and he decided to sleep in the kitchen with the light on that night, hoping it would protect him from the strange nightmares that started to haunt him every night. In his dreams, he wandered down endless hallways that led to dark corners, hearing whispers calling his name and feeling cold hands reaching for his face. He woke up in the middle of the night, unable to tell where the dreams ended and reality began. One night, he heard someone moving through the house. He wanted to get up, but felt paralyzed, and he sensed something right behind him. Gradually, fear took hold of his mind, turning each moment in the house into torment. Eventually, he decided to talk to the locals to learn more about the house. He went to the village store and once again saw the old woman who had given him the keys. Gathering his courage, he asked her about the previous tenants. She was silent for a long time, as if deciding whether or not to tell him anything. Finally, she sighed and began to speak. "At one time, people did live in that house," she said, "but everyone who stayed there long enough eventually disappeared. Anyone who dared to stay there went mad or vanished without a trace. No one knows what happened to those who lived there before," she muttered, looking away. Alexey felt a chill settle over him. He realized he'd stumbled into a story from which there might be no escape. Nonetheless, he resolved to stay. The next night, Alexey set up a camera in his room to record everything that happened. He wanted to prove to himself that it was all just his imagination. But when he reviewed the footage in the morning, he saw a shadow moving slowly down the hallway toward his bed in the dead of night. When it was almost beside him, the camera flickered, and then the room appeared empty again, though Alexey was sure he'd seen something. He began to feel that he was no longer alone in the house. An inexplicable fear took root in his mind. He felt the gaze of an unseen presence following him, peering over his shoulder, even slipping into his dreams. One day, as he stepped out of the shower, he saw someone standing behind him in the mirror. He turned sharply, but no one was there. By the fifth day, Alexey couldn't take it anymore. He decided to leave, even though his rental term wasn't over. But when he tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The same thing happened with the windows. Not a single one would open, and it felt as though the walls of the house were closing in around him. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. Panicked, he ran up to the attic, where he spotted a small window. When he looked outside, he saw a woman in old-fashioned clothing with long hair standing at the edge of the forest. In the next instant, her gaze locked onto him, alive and piercing. She raised a hand and beckoned him. Alexey spent his last night in the house, knowing that there was no way out. Now, all he could do was wait for the shadow that visited him each night to finally take him. The last entries in his journal were short and frantic. He described how he felt himself slipping into madness, as a voice in his head commanded him to go into the night. His final words were, "I'm coming the next day." When the old woman came to the house, she found it empty. There was no trace of Alexey, only cold walls and the old journal lying on the table, open to the last page.